So I met Robert Maynor at the Pat Conroy Center a few months ago. Several of us members saw him speak there, and he was very eloquent, and what was very striking is the amount of detail that he put into his writing. So I thought it would be very, very beneficial for the membership to understand how he does it, number one, what he's doing, and how he does it, straight from the source. So Robert Maynor, he's a short story writer and novelist from the Low Country of South Carolina, of course. Lives and writes in a patched up fish camp on the bank of the Modesto River, the longest free-flowing black water river in North America. His fiction explores the spectrum of complexities and contradictions in the contemporary American South. His short stories have appeared in Blood Orange Review, Bull, the Carolina Quarterly, and Craft, among other outlets. His work has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and he is the past recipient of the Larry Brown Short Story Award and the Coker Fellowship in Fiction from South Carolina Academy of Authors. His book, The Big Game is Every Night, is his debut novel. And so I want to introduce Robert Maynor.
All right. Thank y'all. Thanks for having me. It's good to be in Hilton Head on a Monday. Usually here on the weekend if I'm here. But not too far from Walterboro. So I live outside of Walterboro now. Grew up in Berkeley County on the edge of Wasmasaw Swamp. That really inspired a lot of my writing. And so if it's okay with y'all, I'm going to just start with reading some from the beginning of the novel here. I always like to read from the beginning because it's hard to set up other pieces, and so hopefully this gives an idea. But then happy to just have more of a discussion. I've got some things detail-oriented and how to incorporate some of that I'm happy to talk about, but also to make it most productive, feel like a dialogue might be best. So I'll start just by reading some from the intro here. It's called again, The Big Game is Every Night. On a warm Saturday morning after a game, floating in a John boat on Lake Moultrie with my cousin Marcus, I tried to explain how it felt. The hard breaths I pulled at the end of a long run, the glow of the floodlights shining over the aluminum bleachers, hot dog steam rising from the concession stand, the sound of the marching band. It felt like being born, opening new eyes to a world I'd never known. It was all worth that whenever it came, brief and strange as it was. Morning, sprinting stairs until my eyes went blurry. 2 days in July, temperatures in the high 90s. When I got home after a game, I'd shower, lie down in my bed, and reach back for that feeling only to find it hidden. Not like a memory or a dream, like a story someone told me I didn't even fully believe. First love's always like that, Marcus said. Enjoy it. He weighed 350 pounds, bore a patchy red goatee on his chin, and smoked mentholated Pall Mall cigarettes. He was a fireman and possessed the type of grocery store knowledge and blind self-confidence that can make a normal man seem wise to a 15-year-old boy. Talk to me again when y'all start losing, or when you get a girlfriend. We'd won our first 4 games that year, and people were getting expectations. Marcus came to all my games, even though he hated football. Sat up in the top of the bleachers and sipped from a smuggled-in pint of Wild Turkey 101. He reeled in his line, and the hook was clean. Fishing on credit, I said, more often than not. He pinched a wad of stink bait out of the plastic tub between his feet and balled it up on his hook, then dropped it back down to the bottom of the lake. We caught 8 or 10 fish before lunch, mostly the native channel cats with long whiskers and mossy yellow hide, speckled down their spines with brown. A few transplants, too, Arkansas blues, fat from lip to tail. Reeling them in, you weren't sure whether it was a fish or an old tire, just dead weight all the way. Marcus motored us back to Arrowhead Landing, ospreys flying overhead, outboard Johnson humming, the wind, a thick, wet tongue against my cheeks. Marcus liked putting in at Arrowhead because they had a paved boat ramp and a little store where you could buy bait and cigarettes. There was a campground on the bank there, too. So people had their campers and trucks parked by the lake, little fires burning. An old concrete swimming pool was dug behind the store, empty, but for some rainwater. We coasted up to the boat ramp and Marcus let me off. I went to the truck, a rusty Ford Ranger, and backed it slowly down the ramp. I was getting pretty good at driving forward, but backward was another thing. And with the trailer attached, I couldn't always remember which way to turn the wheel to make the trailer go the way I wanted. Finally, I got it straight. We got the boat out of the water. Marcus lumbered into the store for a bag of ice while I strapped down the stern. He came back out and dumped the ice over the fish where they were croaking in an orange bucket. "Gotta feed the pigs," he said, chewing on an unlit cigarette. We took Mudville Road toward Highway 76, the asphalt blanched nearly silver by the sun and pitted with holes that made the boat rattle on its trailer. Marcus drove, and I looked out the open window at the pine trees and the ditches choked with litter, thinking about a play in the second quarter the night before where I was supposed to run behind Conrad, the right guard, but instead bounced outside and got tackled for a loss. I almost always followed the plays how they were drawn, but sometimes I got in a groove and wanted to wing it, test the water, explore possibilities. But Coach Hendrickson hated that, and I knew he'd bring it up come Monday. Marcus slid a disc into the CD player and a rambling lo-fi guitar riff began to play, some home-cooked recording from one of the obscure bands he always listened to. When he wasn't fishing or working at the fire station, he was watching live performances on YouTube. We pulled into the parking lot of Henry's Grocery at the crossroads of Mudville and Highway 76, went inside and ordered 2 cheeseburger baskets and a plate of fried okra to share. We waited at the counter until the food came out, then carried it to a table in the back beside the drink cooler. The walls were hung with cheap fishing tackle, and at the end of one of the shelves sat 3 bins of late-season vegetables for sale by the dozen. "Careful you don't get fat now hanging around with me," Marcus said. "I'll work it off." I took a bite of my burger and warm juice ran down my chin. I wiped it with the back of my hand. "Who y'all play this week?" "Gadsden, whom the world have left behind." Marcus shoveled a few pieces of fried okra in his mouth. "They ain't that bad this year. Got a decent linebacker, 56. He's supposedly getting recruited. Even Alabama wants him." Well, that ought to drive up the price of real estate. Marcus lived alone in a ramshackle single-wide trailer off Black Tom Road. He picked up lost hubcaps from the roadside and lent them against the tattered skirting of his trailer. He'd been doing it for years. He said it was so folks could come back for them, but none ever did that I knew. They shimmered with sunlight as we pulled into the drive. It was like the trailer was hovering just over the land. We cleaned the catfish at the piecemeal skinning table Marcus had built against the back of his trailer, a porcelain sink basin set in a stainless tabletop, mounted on 4x4 posts and fed water by a garden hose. We'd been cleaning fish together since I was old enough to hold a knife. It was second nature. I sliced the fish vertically behind the head, then ran the tip of the knife horizontally along the dorsal fin until it hit the ribs, glided the blade around the ribs and drug it tight along the backbone, separating meat from the spine, all the way down to the tail. I flipped the fish over and did the same thing on the other side, then slid it down to Marcus. He cut the skin off each fillet and trimmed any belly meat I might have left before dropping the carcass in the orange bucket. Yellow Jackets hovered around the table, laughing at the spilt blood and slime. Marcus's cat, Spooky, wandered out of the stand of pines and gums behind us, black with one little patch of white on top of her head. She rubbed up against Marcus's legs and chirped. He fed her little pieces of the trimmings. "We got 'em trained, the whole kingdom, ain't it? They hear that Ford pulling the yard on a Saturday, they're hitting the chow line. Bees lining up on the table, Spooky wandering up out of her hole. Buzzards is probably back there around the gut pile licking their beaks." He dug a Pall Mall out of his breast pocket and lit it up, fingers still bloody, bringing the wildlife up by hand. "Lydia likes cats," I said, "but her daddy won't let her have one." "Still talk to her?" "Sometimes." "I seen her at the game," Marcus smiled, "working for the Peanut Man." Lydia's father, Ronald Prevost, owned a bull peanut cart he towed to gas station parking lots and special events, like high school football games. The rig was really just a steel box on trailer tires with a rough-cut window, Prevost's peanuts painted on the side. He sold original and hot by the pound, cooked them right there in the trailer over propane fires in 2 enormous aluminum pots, sweat beading on the steel. Sometimes Lydia worked the till. One afternoon over the summer when they were parked at Henry's, me and Marcus pulled in for peanuts. Lydia was at the window, a string of fake pearls around her light brown neck. Ronald was slumped over in the corner on a folding chair, asleep. "We'll take a pound of hot," Marcus said. Lydia took a sip from a can of Mountain Dew. "You ain't even gonna make any small talk first? Bitch about the heat? Ask about business? Pretend I actually want to be here talking to you?" "I don't play make-believe," Marcus said. "I like that." Lydia turned, lifted the lid off one of the pots, and dipped out a batch of peanuts with a big slotted spoon. "You go to Sandridge too, don't you?" she asked me as she poured the peanuts on a vegetable scale hanging from the ceiling. I was surprised she recognized me. She was a grade ahead and we didn't have any classes together. "Yeah, I go there." She checked the scale and ladled on a few more peanuts, then poured them in a plastic bag and twisted it close. "Play football or something, don't you?" "Running back." "Couldn't tell you the difference," Lydia said, "but that's cool." Marcus handed her a $5 bill and she gave him the bag of peanuts. "Thank you," Marcus said. We turned to leave. "Hold on a second." Lydia tore the edge off the bill and wrote her phone number in blue ink, handed it to me through the window. "Text me sometime." I did that night, but I didn't know what to say, so I just wrote, "Hey, this is Grady Hayes from today." We started texting fairly regular, and about once a week she'd call me with some crazy dilemma. Whether a dent in a can made the food inside go bad. Should she check the oil in her Oldsmobile with the motor running or not? But anytime I saw her in the hallway, those fake pearls against her tan neck, I got too nervous to speak. I brought the last fish out of the sink, a channel cat, maybe 3 or 4 pounds. "Reckon she saw any of the game?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "Them boys was lining up for peanuts. Seems like everybody got a thing for them light-skinned girls. Her daddy is white." I didn't say there was nothing wrong with it. Shit, if I was you, I'd be bird dogging that little honey too. I cut the fish quickly and slid it over to Marcus. He finished it off and I took the gut bucket without saying anything, walked into the woods. Tall trees shaded out most of the sun, thick trunks gnarled with knotty growths. Mosquitoes whined in my ears. Marcus made everything into a joke. Usually it was all right, but sometimes it got under my skin. At the gut pile, the brush was packed down from the scavengers rooting. Dirt covered in bones. Mostly catfish, their thick gray skulls and dark eye sockets. Even the guts we dumped the weekend before were already picked clean. You had to watch where you were walking because the vertebrae were thin and sharp, scattered from the birds and the possum's shaking spines. I emptied the bucket and headed carefully back to the yard. Marcus was waiting for me. "You helping me cook tomorrow?" he asked. It was Meemaw's 70th birthday, so we were having a fish fry at her and Shorty's place. Marcus was handling fish and potatoes. His mom, Aunt Gail, was bringing coleslaw. My mom had agreed to make a coconut cake. That way, Meemaw wouldn't have to cook. Marcus had arranged all the plans the week before. Figured I would. "Good, you can do the taters. I already got a bag inside." He took his cell phone out of his pocket and looked at the time. "I got a shift starts in 4 hours. I'm going to sleep a little while. You want to go home now, or you want me to drop you on the way?" "I guess now." We unhooked the boat from the Ranger, and Marcus handed me his keys so I could drive. We took Black Tom Road back to Highway 76, past the Methodist Church and Sandridge Fire Station, where Marcus worked. We had the windows trimmed down, and I was resting my elbow on the ledge, steering with one hand. I had my restricted permit for about 3 months, and I loved to drive. The feeling of the hard, grainy steering wheel. I could turn it any which way, and that's where we'd go. I controlled the destination and the path. Even if I was just going where Marcus or whoever else told me, it was my hand on the wheel, my choice to follow. That's what I loved most. We crossed the little bridge over Wassamasaw Swamp. Below, 2 old men in wide-brimmed straw hats fished with cane poles. A couple miles further, I turned off onto Lantana Lane, where me and Mom lived in a yellow house. Pulled into the driveway and shifted into park. "Not bad," Marcus said. "Getting the hang of it." I nodded and got out of the truck. Marcus scooted over behind the wheel. "Pick you up tomorrow at noon. Be careful tonight." "Always am." He winked and started backing down the drive. "Just putting out fires." Thanks.
So what I appreciate about the reading, which is a very similar reading that you did at Pat Conroy, is the sensory description, what you see, hear, feel, touch, smell, etc. and it's very obviously cultural because you've been in this environment for a long time. So can you describe how you do it aside from experience it? And how do you actually write it down?
Yeah. I think I'm always writing about the places that I know and the people that I know, and I think that's a so for one, I think that coming from that lived and experienced experience is one way. But I also write predominantly in the first person. This book's in the first person. In the voice of a narrator or of any character is always one of the most important aspects of finding a story for me. And also in the first person, you like any details or observations that are noticed by that character, right? And then so in that way, the detail that Grady Hayes, that is the narrator, what he notices and what he sees and hears, I think are illustrate something to do with his character, right? We all see things slightly differently, or maybe drastically differently. But I think that perspective to me is really when I feel when I feel like there's something really there, when you've got a character and you've got a voice and they're noticing things. So a lot of times like just fishing around for that right voice and that right character. And when they start noticing things, and I think sort of creating that to me is you're just kind of like along for the ride, documenting what they see, and that's when I feel the most comfortable, and I think what happened here. But I think just being, a lot, hearing it when you're not at the desk to write, like listening when you're out and about. I always say like the things that inspire my fiction are like the conversations I have at the gas station, or with whatever it may be, but sort of listening, or maybe even a conversation that I'm not having, that I'm hearing, eavesdropping at a gas station, wherever it may be. So I think really tuning in to your community and your surroundings. That's where I find it sort of off the cuff.
How do you capture that when you hear it from the gas station or wherever you happen to be? Do you write it, jot it down? You have a voice recorder? You put it on your phone? What do you do?
I have for me, my philosophy is if it sticks, then it might be worthwhile. So I don't take notes or write things down unless it's like that the way that it was said, maybe the cadence or like the exact word choice. Sometimes I will write that down. But for the most part, to me, it's if it sticks with you, then maybe it will stick with someone else. So I'm not a copious note taker. Yeah.
What else? Other questions?
I was struck by the catfish.
Yeah.
Like you start with the skull and the eyes, then you go into where you find them. They've been ravaged by various critters, and you mentioned the skeleton and then the feel of the spine. So how do you decide what order you're going to do that in when you have all those different descriptives?
I don't know exactly the order. Actually, I've been when there is that sort of like tactile experience. I think that experiencing it is like the way to do it. I remember not with that I don't remember exactly, but I remember a different story that I was working on that was like it involved a cinder block, like picking up a cinder block and stacking it. And I just kind of wrote that, but then weeks later, at some point picking up a cinder block. In that, like you actually feel, there's like a definition of when you lift, and that to me is like when you pick up a cinder block, what sticks out to you? Is it like the rough way it sort of like grinds? Is it the weight of it? And I think that sort of determines some of the order, like what you're emphasizing. And I always kind of find myself on this sort of like spectrum too, of like more details so that it feels lived in, or like you want to do this, but at some point I do think you can have too much. And if you're just looking to like incorporate detail for which one that to me is like, it means it's not strong enough or it's not as important enough. So you sort of move on from that. Like, of course, you see a catfish skull. One of the things that you take home is like these huge eye sockets on the top of the head. So like that to me is a clear And I don't remember with the cinder block, but that's like feeling it. And I was like, I wrote about this, and I did not write about what it felt like when I just picked this thing up. So like, let me go back and adjust. And some of that I think is part of it too, of like always revising, always being able to go back when you have that experience, and sort of having the sort of matrix of those things.
And so to your point around the level of detail, whether you're backing up the truck on too much detail versus having too scarce of details, but how do you find that balance? Is it just revision, or?
Yes, in my mind, revision.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, maybe this is the sort of process for writing, and I also feel like these things are always difficult because I like never know what I'm doing. It's like every morning is a new experience, and like, okay, well, let me try and figure this story out or this sentence out. But what I revise sort of so I write in the mornings, I write a sort of chunk and then go away from it. The next morning, come back, read if it's like a chapter, or if it's a full story, read from the beginning all the way to the point where you left off, and then go from there. And if anything feels false or is like, or whatever, maybe you can use it better down the line. So my first instinct is always like load it up with those kinds of things, like leave yourself some room to work with down the line. But like when you hear it, when you read it back to yourself the next day, does it sound right? And like that, and that's always, that's a sort of ridiculous thing to be like, it does it sound right? Mm-hmm. But like, you'll know, I think, and if there's anything that you trip over or you feel like you have to labor over it, that's a point of like, it's not working, and does it need more work, or does it need to come out of there? And that's.
You read it oral?
I do sometimes, not every morning, but yeah, especially when there's something that just kind of like catches, whether it doesn't sound right or the whatever it may be, I'll read it out loud. Yeah.
How do you decide how much detail is too much detail?
I think about the overall pacing of the story. I think, and so I have to I have to take it all the way through and then go back and make that sort of judgment. And typically the voice to me dictates it. It's like once I have, whether it's a narrator's voice or the sort of narrative voice, if it's in third person, I think it still applies, but like typically it's that cadence of speech, and it's like, okay, that's what they would say. But then other times, I think once you have a sort of narrative fleshed out, then you can go back and see, does this advance the story, and then you can think about trimming. So I kind of tend towards more in the like drafting process, and then sort of scale back from there. But I also have someone else read it, and they'll say, this is boring, you've got too much details in here, whatever it may be. My girlfriend is great at that. She's good at saying when it's too boring. So
so you have other people reading your content before it's ready. Is that fair?
It depends.
Oh, sure.
So I talked a story about that. Nobody read a section of this book until I had a draft finished, because I was convinced that like someone would say a sort of offhand comment, and I'd be like, oh, that's it, it's ruined, I didn't, like that's it, I can never. So I was like, no, I got to get through this thing one way or another, good, bad, whatever. So I usually have a draft of something, like I have fleshed out that narrative and done it, and then I'll hand it off to someone. So like with a short story, that's a little bit easier. You're not writing for like years saying, I hope this is good, I hope this is good. So that, but I usually have some idea of it. And then at that point, like you've done your thing, then you need another perspective, I think. Yeah.
It's more a comment than a question, but I just think your voice is so strong and unique. I guess there is a question embedded in that, but just, we won our first 4 games and people were getting expectations. And the win was a thick, wet tongue against my chief.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
People would know it's you writing and not, one of us. So my question is, you said you only write first person.
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah, have you experimented with that, and how does that change your writing?
I just find myself sort of defaulting to an oral sort of approach. So I sort of, what drew me to writing was like it was really storytelling. I think it was like being around other people that are telling fiction stories, jokes, family sort of passed down stories. And so for me, the stories that I was most interested in always sort of came about in that way of like, especially, so like being told. And so to me, when I'm thinking, whether it's a narrator's voice or it's, like a third person narrator's voice or like a character's voice, to me, it's got to be distinct either way. So for me, I've gotten to this, I'm not, I guess I'll also, like, not a huge fan of the sort of omniscient narrator that can sort of zoom in and out to characters. I like to read that sometimes, but writing it, I really struggle with that. So even when I'm writing in third person, I've got to figure out like who's the person telling this story and what is their voice. So it's really the same process. So I think that's kind of roundabout, and I don't know if I'm answering the question, but it's like trying to replicate someone's voice. And I'm not saying like I'm going to pick you and I'm going to replicate your voice, but like I have to know this person and their perspective, because in my mind, even a narrator would be an interesting one, is speaking in from an experience.
You remind me of Hal Holbrook and Mark Twain Tonight, because you kind of become that character. And do you like imitating the character that you're? Because it worked for me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the reading of the process is different than the taking it from there. It's sometimes, but yeah, that is like whoever the character is, however they're speaking. That to me, and also dialogue, I think is like that. I typically, and maybe I predominantly write short stories, and that's where I feel most comfortable and come up. And that to me is like, get from interesting dialogue to interesting dialogue and then out of there as quickly as possible. And I feel like that's sort of my default mode, is just like get two people that speak interestingly and get them talking to each other. So that to me is I do like hearing the characters kind of in those conversations. So in that way, I kind of like to embody them. But
do you
yes, sir.
possibly use? I'm just wondering, like, do
Sure.
you inform the detail from a character's viewpoint? I mean, do you actually consciously think, I'm this character, I want them to describe this detail completely different than this character, because it really is. I mean, are you very conscious of the fact that it's two different voices, and that character, you define them in your mind enough that they're gonna describe this table and what's happening at it completely different than this person is going to. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
If it's all first person, right? Like, it's always your description of the room. Whereas are you informing the characters by informing how the room looks to them?
I'm always trying to do that. Yeah, 100% in getting into and that is that to me then reveals the character, what the character is observing. And so like the line that you refer of like people were getting expectations, to me that's like something that, to me, like the perspective of a 15-year-old was like, they're expecting things of a, you know what I mean? It's like not being particularly articulate, and just like people are thinking about us, you know? And so like that just being a sort of example. But there's another, everything is sort of about the feel and the sound and the balance, and those are kind of boring things. But like, I don't overly labor, like, are you sure that's what are you sure he said it that way? Like, kind of when you know, and I hate to, that's kind of the gist, but like.
But you're conscious of it.
Yeah, completely, 100%. Yeah.
I love the first person aspect of your writing, and one of the things that really struck me in this piece, so it's less a question than it is a commentary, was when this first person character received some information from someone that set wrong with them. And so he walked away with his bucket but then continued having the conversation. You talk about dialogue, and you have great, really rich dialogue, which is hard to write, certainly for me, but he continued the dialogue with himself. So it was first person speaking and then first person thinking, and we got all of that very smoothly, and a real understanding of the character in a way that I would also walk away from something I wasn't comfortable, you know, it's something that felt really, really, really real. And that one section really spoke to me. It was really wonderfully done.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. That to me is one of the most difficult parts, is that managing of like what's said out loud versus what's said internally. To me, it's one of the most interesting things about fiction,
It's perfect.
right? Because like if someone walks away from you, you're like in the middle of you're like, what did I say? What did he do? Oh, I guess I said that, you know, like that. It's like you actually get to be in that
Yes.
space. So I appreciate the
That was
kind words.
perfectly
Thank you.
captured. It was just beautiful.
Thank you.
So, what's your background, and is writing your full-time job?
No. So I actually, I work for the Coastal Conservation League. We're an environmental advocacy organization. There's an office based in Beaufort. I work in our Charleston office. And I work in community and land conservation predominantly. And to me, it's sort of two sides of the same coin. I feel like I in writing, try to capture and celebrate the sort of distinct communities that I know from the Lowcountry, and then I also work to try and advocate to preserve them. So to me, it's like storytelling about them, and then also like actively in a different way, trying to protect them and find that overlap between like community preservation and environmental, but also like cultural preservation. So, so yeah, it's a balance in the difficult part. I think is finding the right balance. So I write in the mornings before work, and or try to.
What those hours?
Huh?
What hours?
Do I write?
No, 5 to 7, or when do you have to be at work?
It's a little bit flexible. So, but I write early. So I wake up at 5:30, immediately go write. I have a sort of word count that I'm trying to hit, but I usually got about an hour. And then I put it away, then sort of start my day. That's, you know, like wake up, coffee, write, get to a time or a word count, and then like, okay, put that away, take a shower, drive to work. That sort of separates the next thing. And that's the only, to have some kind of separation is the most difficult part.
I can see where you'd be exposed to a lot of what you write about.
Yeah, that's the fun part about it, and in getting to do, so it works out. Yeah.
So it sounds like your education was in the sciences?
No,
No?
but good guess. But English. So I actually studied writing. I got an English degree from Maynor University, a small liberal arts university in the upstate. I got a master's in a joint program at College Charleston and the Citadel in English literature, not in creative writing. I worked at the College of Charleston for a few years, and then but I also whole time witnessing a sort of rapid transformation of the Lowcountry. The communities that I grew up in, where I'm from, looks drastically different than it did when I was young, and so just felt this sort of calling to engaging my community. I interpret or try to convey scientific writing and theories and ideas to a broader audience and sort of relay those things. So in that way, it makes a lot of sense. This is an advocacy organization. Like writing is an essential form of advocacy. So everyone always guesses one way or the other. Here I am.
I love stories like that, because people make assumptions about what you have to do in terms of training to be X, and it's almost never true.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. Question over here.
We're talking about detail,
Uh-huh.
and everybody wants to know how you organize your detail. I saw 3 ways that you were doing that.
Okay.
Whether you do it consciously or not. But one was, of course, chronological order. You do that. Another is spatial order, how you see things. Then you wrote that down. And the third thing is order of importance, I think. So what was important to you is how you ordered your details. Are you conscious of that?
Absolutely not. No. I would have said and have tried to say or emphasize the importance. That's what I would, if I had to, I'd try to, like what stands out the most. But no, That makes sense, though. I think both of those make sense. Yeah.
My favorite details, the hubcaps,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah,
the
that was
comment that the trailers seem to be floating,
Mhm.
and immediately being me, I'm thinking, wow, is that foreshadowing something? And, you know, so I start looking for things about the character that lives in that trailer, because you just told us something.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I'm glad.
it's very
I'm glad.
interesting.
Yeah.
And that was stated because they don't have hubcaps anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So it sounds like for you, the first thing is voice.
Mm-hmm.
Once you discover the voice, and the voice allows you to start finding details. So how do you plot? Once you have the voice, how do you plot?
That's the hardest part for me. In this case, very structured. So this is a very traditional 3-act structure. It has only one narrator, the first person narrator. And I think I sort of didn't plot it out, but had a general plot structure in mind when I said about it, because I think I try to overcompensate for weaknesses by like that sort of play. So the voice is always, to me, that's what I'm comfortable with. That's what I like the most. I was like, okay, well now like what actually happens? I don't like, it's fun for me to just hang out with this person that's talking. But it's, you know, you have to have something. So with this, it was to sort of revert to a very traditional structure as like forms of guardrails whenever it was sort of wandering. And then you kind of wander into some, so I don't, like I said, plot it out, map it out. I had the character, a very overarching sort of like shape of the narrative, and then kind of go from there. In short stories, I experiment a little bit more, particularly with structure. I think it's really interesting, various structures that short stories can take. But same thing, I think like if you build even your own sort of like rule book for how a story is going to be, like maybe it alternates between perspectives, whatever it may be. That so to me, I have to almost like get the voice in the creative part, what kind of themes, that kind of stuff, and then like find a shape to fit it into. So yeah, leaning hard into the structure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This is a two-part question.
Sure.
Have all of the characters that you've spoken through been male? And have you ever thought you could or would develop a female character and speak in her voice?
So no, I have written short stories from a female perspective. To me, it's always I always feel I want to experience that. I want to try and sort of live in that voice and see things from that perspective. Then also it always makes me nervous, right? Like, am I misconstruing something? Am I, you know, like, is this presumptuous? So in short fiction, I have, and I want to do that more. I think it's really important to empathetic, like for like personal reasons, you know, live in those characters' perspectives. I think when you sort of transition from like that to like taking it out to a wider audience is what always just makes me nervous. But it makes me nervous no matter what. Like whenever somebody's going to read whatever I've written, that's what makes me nervous, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, right.
But yeah, it's I struggle with that, but I do.
Some men can do it really well, and others not so much. So I'm sure it's a difficult thing to do,
Mhm.
but for me to write in a man's voice, the same kind of thing.
And was that? Did you have two questions? You said? Or?
Well, they were.
Oh, okay, related.
Are
Yeah.
all your characters?
Yes. So I try to mix it up.
Do you have books in your mind, in the works, that you know you're going to write about? Or is it something that just comes to you?
Yes, sort of it's got to come to me. It's got to be sort of inspiring. I've got to be interested in it. But then it's got to last beyond that, because a lot of times I'll have, this great idea, this person said something, you go, and then it's like, actually I sort of, you know, missed the mark. So I think it's the story I'm writing is the most important story at that time, whatever it may be. And so I think that's always how I treat it.
You haven't got a suitcase of ideas that you wanna write down.
No.
You write one at a time.
Not exactly, but for the most part,
Okay.
yeah. It really is. I like to. I do this in the morning before I go to work, right? And I do this because
I'm quite
I
impressed.
love to do this.
I'm quite impressed.
Thank you. And honestly, because I think it's like a compulsion, frankly. And so I don't, to some extent, don't want to spend time on something that's not like gets me going, right? And is interesting and driving it. But I also don't want to just like, this thing is the most important today and this isn't, and then not, so it's again, balance. But like, you've got to be interested in it. But I will say with this book, I wrote it over like a series of 3 years in spurts. And it was like, okay, I know this character, I write to this. And then I kind of wrote to a point where I didn't know what was next. And I put it away and worked on some other things that were sort of captivating at that time with the understanding of like, I've got to finish this one way or another. So it's a balance of like, I don't work on 10 things at a time, but maybe 2, or maybe 3, or like if you're working on something long, like sometimes it feels almost like an escape to work on something different for a little while. So it really is that, but I try like, don't spread it too thin, but also give yourself like, write the thing that you want to write that day. That's the most important thing.
Last question.
If I caught this correctly, so you work for the Coastal Conservation League. You're watching and you're seeing things, your preservation is at your heart. But you mentioned also something of where you originally were from in the Low Country and you're seeing the changes. Have you written on that yet, or like a short story and what are you seeing and where was it originally? Just out of curiosity.
Where I grew up, I always say was the middle of nowhere that very quickly became somewhere. And so it was the middle of nowhere, unincorporated area. There have now 30,000 new homes have been approved there. They're building something the equivalent, the size of the town of Mount Pleasant, which is not as big as Hilton Head, but something like there in the middle of a rural community that was surrounded by timber tracks. So I grew, and so that was like this sort of immediate where you see rural communities and rural land uses and rural culture that's sort of being eroded in my mind. And so I think that everything that I write is coming from something of that. Not always the sort of erosion, but like that tension. I think in the contemporary South, specifically along the coast of South Carolina, like how do we escape that sort of tension? So in some ways, everything is sort of through something of that lens, but more like specifically, I am working on some things. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert.
All right.
Robert
Yeah,
Maynor.
thank y'all.
You have books?
I do. I've got some books over here. Happy for y'all to have some if you want some.